Okay, welcome to part 3, where we will address the second objection to faith, which is that it contradicts the scope of science. And I've bolded the part of the outline that we will be filling out in part 3. In this case, the objector would say that there is no inherent contradiction between faith and science like there was in our first objection. Theoretically, faith is possible. However, since science explains everything there is just no room for faith. So you can have faith, just know that if you do, you are ignoring the scientific explanations. Faith, the objector would say, is just for the primitive, for those who lack the mental capacity to seek more scientific and rational explanations. As science progresses, it is becoming increasingly obvious that mankind has graduated from faith, that faith has served its purpose in advancing our species, and that we are now advanced enough to seek more rational explanations. There are at least two reasons for why one might believe this. The first is that the objector thinks that faith contradicts the scientific method. In other words, they rule out faith as a means by which to determine truth, which leaves only the scientific method. And since they believe everything can be explained scientifically, it is only a matter of time before that happens. Now, this is circular reasoning. You cannot say that science explains everything there is when you have already ruled out the alternative explanations. Nevertheless, people will say that science explains everything there is, and their reason doesn't have as much to do with the evidence as it does with the fact that they have already ruled out faith as an option. So answering this kind of objection is the task of part 2, not part 3. The second reason is, logically speaking, more sound. This is known as the God of the Gaps fallacy, which is assuming divine intervention in the absence of a natural explanation. So it's looking at something you can't understand yet and fallaciously assuming that God is responsible for it. This fallacy has been repeated many times through history. The objector will cite instances where people thought something was explained by faith only to later have it explained by science. And the logic is that if the trend continues, it is only a matter of time before science explains what we now explain with faith. For example, people used to think that thunder was a noise that God or the heavens made, only to have it later explained by lightning. People used to think that disease was an affliction by God, but Louis Pasteur discovered that it was caused by pathogens. And we used to think that thinking was an action of the soul, a reflection of the person's heart. But now we have CT scans to show that thinking is really caused by brain activity, nothing more. An evolutionist would say that people used to believe that God created the universe, but now the Big Bang Theory explains it. Likewise, they would say that the creation account in Genesis 1 and creation accounts like it used to explain how life got here, but now evolution has explained that. Lastly, we used to think that our moral values came from God, but now we know that they are just an evolutionary adaptation. This list could go on, but the logic is that if history repeats itself, and it always does, then it is only a matter of time before science explains what we now explain with faith. So, we had best save ourselves some time and throw it out now. In this objection, the objector is objecting to faith, which they define as belief in anything that is not currently explained by science. For simplicity's sake, I will be using that definition. To be clear, the objector would readily admit that there are some things for which we don't have scientific explanations, like the nature of gravity. But just because we don't have them, they would say, doesn't mean that they don't exist. In other words, the scientific explanation is out there, but we just haven't found it yet. So it's only a matter of time. So we might as well throw faith out now, since we're going to have to do it eventually, right? So whether the explanations come now or later, the objector implies that faith is belief in anything that is not explained by science. Now about this explaining, you can't explain anything only using science. That was part 2. Science can only show you events that are correlated with what you are trying to explain, but it cannot show you a causative link. That was explained in part 2. In part 3, for simplicity's sake, let's use the objector's definition of explain, which means finding events that are closely correlated. So we're adopting the objector's definitions of faith and of explain so that our response to their objection is relevant. Basically, the format of the rebuttals will be to first identify a key assumption, then to show that that assumption is built on faith and not science. Then I will show the inability of science to explain all there is, as well as answer a likely objection. So what is this key assumption? It is that the same event cannot be explained by both faith and science. That is, faith and science are mutually exclusive. You can't have both. One must choose. Now, this assumption is actually a position of faith. There is nothing in science saying that faith and science are mutually exclusive. Science talks about things that are bound by science, but it does not comment on the realm of faith. Therefore, any comment about this on the part of the objector is their presupposition, their epistemology, their position of faith. So in the objector's attempt to destroy faith, they actually reintroduce it, meaning that their objection defeats itself. So why do this? Why assume from the very beginning that one must choose between faith and science? I think part of it is that we are so heavily indoctrinated to believe that faith and science are at odds. It also makes it much easier for the objector to win their argument, as we will see. But it is interesting that the Bible contradicts this idea. It proposes that for the same event, that both faithful and scientific explanations can exist. One does not exclude the other. Let's look at our chart from part 1. When God created the universe, that is a supernatural event. It takes faith to believe that. Yet it can be witnessed scientifically through the order in creation and through the fact that we have a moral compass. So both a faithful and scientific explanation exist. And remember, I am using the objector's definition of explain, which means finding closely correlated events. Or what about Jesus being God? That is a supernatural thing that takes faith to believe. Yet it was witnessed scientifically through the effects of his miracles, like a blind man regaining sight, or through him fulfilling Old Testament prophecies and themes, or through the resurrection. All this evidence can be observed scientifically. At the same time, there is a supernatural explanation. Or what about the miraculous catch of fish? That is supernatural, and yet science was a witness to its supernatural origin through the fact that the disciples had caught nothing and through the number and location of the fish. So all these events have both faithful and scientific explanations, meaning that there is always a scientific finding that accompanies what is caused by faith. Now the objector assumes right off the bat that this can't happen, and that is their position of faith, and it is a faulty position of faith at that. They would look at the list of evidence and say, because a scientific explanation exists, a faithful one cannot, and they would rule out the position of faith that the evidence points to. But this is folly, for it does not follow the evidence where it leads. Or let's use the example of Jesus reportedly healing a blind person. I am sure that if they had had a team of scientists and an MRI machine available in 30 AD, and if they had done an MRI of the nervous system of the man who was healed, that they would have found some scientifically observable changes. For example, maybe the man's optic nerve grew back, or maybe he had increased neural activity in the vision center of the brain. And using the objector's logic, as long as there is a scientific finding, you can rule out faith. Or I am sure if you scientifically observed the man who was healed from lameness, that you could find some muscle hypertrophy in the legs and maybe some increased activity in the motor processing center of the brain. And using the objector's logic, as long as there is a scientific explanation, you can rule out faith. I am sure that if you observed the axe head floating on water, that you could probably find a change in the surface tension of the water, or in the density of the axe, or both. And as long as a scientific finding exists, you can rule out faith. So using this logic, you could explain away just about anything, even obvious miracles. In fact, the very fact that we can observe miracles shows that they manifest scientifically. Otherwise, how would we know it is a miracle? And according to the objector, you can rule out faith because of this. Making this assumption makes it much easier for the objector to win, for all they have to do is to explain away faith is find some scientific finding that coincides with the event. But that is not the kind of thinking that the Bible proposes. If the Bible used the objector's logic, no miracle could be possible. But as it is, the Bible adopts a way of thinking that is much harder to argue with. Since the objector does not consider this, they strawman the Christian faith. That is, they argue against a much weaker version of the Christian faith than actually exists. Because of this assumption, it is commonly believed that Christians only believe in God when there is no scientific explanation. In reality, it is quite the opposite. Christians believe what they do because of the presence of science, not the absence of it. They believe that science points to faith, but this is not something that the objector is willing to consider. Also note that there is much overlap between this assumption and the objection raised in Part 2. By forcing one to choose between faithful and scientific explanations, and then ruling out any faithful explanations, the skeptic leaves only scientific explanations remaining, thus creating what they think is a faith-proof environment for themselves. So my first response to this objection is basically, so what? So what if science explains everything? That doesn't rule out the possibility of faith. But let's imagine, just for argument's sake, that this wasn't the case. Imagine that we had to choose between science and faith. Let's pretend that the statement, science explains everything there is, poses an actual threat to faith. In this spirit, the remainder of Part 3 will address the idea that science explains everything. We're pretending, mostly for the objector's sake, that this statement needs to be addressed. So let's address it. Well, the proposition, science explains everything, is self-defeating. To see this, one only must ask the question, can science explain this proposition? I ask this because by its own logic, if science must explain everything, then that includes that very statement, right? That is, if all things that are true are explainable by science, and that statement is true, then it would need to be explained by science, or it isn't true. If the answer to my question is no, then the proposition is false. And the answer is no, for science has not shown that science can explain all things. If it did, that would be circular reasoning. Science cannot justify itself. That is, science is merely a tool for understanding the natural world. It cannot explain epistemological statements like the one that science explains everything there is. And if science cannot explain that statement, then making it is a position of faith, not science. Therefore, faith exists necessarily. There is no way around it. The moment one tries to disprove it, there it is again. And if it exists necessarily, then the objector's idea that science explains everything is simply false. Also note that this does not include the 7 positions of faith introduced in Part 2. These positions also exist necessarily because we use them to reason. This objection overestimates the capabilities of science. The objector thinks that science can answer all our questions, when in reality, science creates more questions than it answers. Let's look at some of the God of the Gaps examples. People once thought that thunder was explained supernaturally. Then science came along and showed that it was caused by lightning. So the case is closed, right? Faith has successfully been driven out by science. Well, let's look at it more deeply. This discovery only created new questions that did not exist before. such as what types of lightning produce the different types of thunder, or why do the sound waves that lightning produces travel at different speeds? All these questions did not exist prior to the discovery that lightning causes thunder. Likewise, prior to the discovery of pathogens, disease was a curse by God, and that is it. No more explanation needed. But now that pathogens have been discovered, we now have new questions, such as are pathogens non-living or living, or how do pathogens infect cells? The answers to both of these questions are still not fully known. The same could be said of the brain and thinking processes. In fact, entire fields employing thousands of PhD scientists, like neurology, endocrinology, or astronomy, have been founded because science managed to answer one question, and in the process, it created a whole bunch more. So, it is not from the lack of scientific progress that these answers are still unknown. Rather, it is from its progress. By the way, this idea is nothing new. This is common knowledge in the scientific realm. It is known that the more a person knows about science, the more they realize they don't know. So the objector thinks that even if science doesn't currently explain these things, that it will explain them eventually. After all, it's only a matter of time, right? But that is misinformed. It overestimates the capabilities of science. If science creates more questions than it answers, then it cannot explain everything. So by the objector's own logic, there will always be room for faith. In addition, assuming that science will one day explain our unknowns is a position of faith. Can I scientifically prove that science will prove something? Not only is this a position of faith, as we will see, it is not a position that is supported by evidence, which makes it blind faith. Ironically, this objection, by placing blind faith in science, is guilty of the same thing it accuses religions of. And I have a number 16 in parentheses because by the end of this, we will see that this is about the 16th position of faith introduced by the objectors. But even if all our questions were answered by science, this assumption would make a massive extrapolation. Extrapolation is assuming that a trend will continue in the future the same way that it has in the past. It is generally avoided when possible because it introduces error. I like to compare it to a man shooting a gun. The barrel of the gun represents what we observe, and the extrapolation is the path of the bullet, with an accurate conclusion being the target. So the more we extrapolate, the more error exists, and the less likely it is that our conclusion will be accurate. This objection extrapolates because modern science has only been around for a few centuries, and apparently the universe is billions of years old, and will maybe continue to exist for billions of years more. So to say that science will explain everything is to extrapolate our limited experience across billions of years. It extrapolates chronologically. It also extrapolates spatially. That is, what science has observed, even in the present universe, has only scratched the surface of what could be known. And this is because of our limited abilities, and also because of the tendency of science to create more questions than it answers. Either way, it is a massive extrapolation to project our experience across the entire universe and all of time. In fact, I would say that it takes more faith to believe that than to admit that we need faith. Therefore, because of this assumption, this objection commits a science of the gaps fallacy. That is, it passively assumes that science will one day explain everything, without having the slightest idea of how. It continues to do this even in the face of conflicting evidence, because it is simply unwilling to consider the alternative, which is faith. Making epistemic claims like this has no place in the scientific world. With this in mind, the statement that science explains everything runs into another problem. in that there seems to be a great number of things that science cannot explain. These include the positions of faith in Part 2, which science cannot explain. There are also things that science could explain but hasn't, and likely never will. That is the subject of the rest of Part 3. These things include belief in consciousness, so the objector probably thinks they are self-aware. There is also the presence of desires, so the objector desires to be grounded in evidence. There are moral values and the resulting moral responsibility, so maybe the objector thinks that the Crusades were morally wrong, and that the Crusaders should be held accountable. There is a meaning that the objector finds in their life. Then there are the objector's emotions. Perhaps they have a romantic attraction to someone. There is beauty. Perhaps they believe that sunsets are beautiful. That is just the start. It also includes anything else that is not currently explained by science. By the end of this list, we will see just how silly it is to deny faith. Because the objector exercises these positions of faith, that makes this objection hypocritical, which means to say one thing and do another. That is, the objector denies faith with their words, but affirms it with their actions. Even if they think science will one day explain these things, that is still demonstrating faith in science. In the next few slides, I will show why these beliefs are positions of faith. To do this, it is necessary to understand two things. One is that, scientifically speaking, we are nothing more than giant, extremely complex molecules. Of course, I wouldn't want to be the one that has to name the molecule that we call a human being, but theoretically it could be done. So my friend Bob might be a molecule that is arranged in such a way that he has red hair, and I might be a slightly different molecule with purple hair. Scientifically, we are molecules, nothing more. What molecules do is either 1, predetermined, or 2, random. Either a molecule's interactions are determined by the natural laws that explain matter, or they are completely random with no cause. Therefore, the objector must apply their naturalistic worldview to people, themselves included. They must believe that everything we do is either predetermined or random. As we will see, this makes it very difficult to explain things like beauty, emotions, or consciousness. Therefore, when the objector believes in such things, they exercise faith, not science. The second thing to understand is that it is from the progress of science, not its absence, that we come to such conclusions. Before modern science had advanced, to doubt science's ability to explain, for example, consciousness, may have been a bit premature. But that is not the case now. We have the evidence, and we are still left wondering. This defuses the inevitable objection, which says, well, we just haven't progressed enough scientifically to be able to explain these things. But don't worry, the explanations are fast on their way. We have progressed, and still there is no explanation. Of course, I am not saying that science will never explain these things. That would be logically impossible to do. What I am saying is that science has advanced to the point that if it could explain these things, that it very likely would have. So the fact that it hasn't is evidence that these are indeed positions of faith. So scientifically, we are molecules, which makes it difficult for science to explain why we do things that don't seem very molecular. And we know this not from the absence of science. This is not God of the gaps, but from its progress. These points will be reiterated throughout the next few slides. Starting with consciousness, molecules are not self-aware. They don't realize that they are a molecule because they're a molecule. And yet, are we not just molecules? Belief in consciousness is a position of faith. And by being blunt, I don't mean to disrespect the naturalist's worldview or to present a caricature of it. I am only trying to get to the bottom of the issue as fast as I can to save us all some time. One of my professors once said that the craziest thing about the human brain is that it is a bunch of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms arranged in such a way that they know who they are. And I agree, that is pretty crazy. However, saying that such atoms explain consciousness is a bit of a stretch. Of course, we can observe brain activity that is correlated with consciousness, but that is not the same as explaining it, as discussed earlier. And this is a weaker argument, but is still worth mentioning. If consciousness can be explained molecularly, then why can't our supercomputers and artificial intelligence systems think by now? They are complex arrangements of molecules, so complex that they give the appearance of thinking, and yet we know that they are merely machines that can only do what they were programmed to do. It seems that if self-awareness could be explained molecularly, that it would have been by now, given the complexity of the machines we have built, or at least there would be some level of progress towards it as the complexity of the machine increases. But this has not happened. Perhaps this is because, philosophically speaking, one would have to step outside of consciousness to objectively study it, which makes scientifically proving it impossible. Therefore, every time the objector assumes that they consciously do something, they exercise faith. And this conclusion is not from the lack of science, but from its progress. We have the PET scans, we have the MRI scans of the brain, we have the supercomputers and artificial intelligence, and yet we are still left wondering. Next on the list is desires. Molecules don't want anything. When an oxygen atom binds with a hydrogen atom to form water, the oxygen pretty much hogs the electrons. But the hydrogen atoms don't get mad like this kid saying, "Give me my electrons back," because it's just an atom. It doesn't think, it doesn't want anything. And yet, scientifically, are we not just an extremely complex molecule? If a small molecule doesn't want things, what makes us think that a big one will? Explaining how we get desires from atoms is quite difficult. So every time the objector wants something, such as wanting science to explain everything, they exercise faith. And this is not from the lack of science, but from its presence. We have been studying chemistry long enough to know that molecules don't want things. This principle is often forgotten. Science is often taught like molecules, especially biomolecules, do want something. I guess that makes them more relatable, but that is not scientifically accurate. Molecules do not care about right or wrong. Our water molecule is in the middle, trying to decide if robbing a bank is a morally bad idea or a morally good one. But the truth is it doesn't care, because it's a molecule. It can't care, because its actions are either predetermined or random. And yet, scientifically speaking, are we not just an extremely complex molecule? Explaining how we get moral values scientifically is called the is to ought problem in ethics. As far as I am aware, this problem has not been successfully answered. Because molecules don't have moral values, they can do no wrong. Let's say our extremely complex molecule that we call Bob decides to rob a bank. If we are truly just molecular, then Bob's actions are either predetermined or completely random, neither one of which explains why he should be held morally accountable for his actions. After all, it was Bob's molecular properties that made him rob the bank, not Bob. And we know this not from the lack of science, but from its progress. It is only through the progress of biochemistry that we know just how molecular we actually are. Now, to be fair, there are other theories that attempt to scientifically explain why we should hold Bob accountable or why Bob is wrong. Each one of these theories has its unique flaws, but one that they all have in common is that they pit human desires as the driving force behind morality. That means that they borrow from faith and are not purely scientific. Also, because they attempt to explain moral values scientifically, they fail to explain why anything is inherently right or wrong. Moving on, molecules have no purpose. The truth is that if we are just a giant molecule, then we have no more purpose than the atoms that make us up. Sure, we can make something up, like going and saving the spotted owls or helping the poor or making money, but that is purely subjective and has no objective basis. In the end, the molecular machines that we are stop working. We die, and that's it. No purpose. Now, some say that this fact should give us purpose. Since we only have one life, we need to make it count, right? But this objection is a distraction from my argument. I am not saying that there is no purpose, but rather that that purpose cannot be determined molecularly. So the space picture demonstrates what a purposeless life is like. It would feel something like an asteroid floating through the empty void of space, with no reference point. Instead of coming to grips with this fact, the objector often dubs these complex molecules called people with a purpose, particularly themselves, just like the person in this picture is being dubbed a knight. But know that that is not scientific. Richard Dawkins, a prominent atheist, once stated, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." At least he had the honesty to admit the implication of naturalism. So when the objector feels like their life has a purpose, they are borrowing from faith, which permits belief in things that have not been scientifically explained. Moving on, molecules don't feel anything. They aren't emotional. Maybe the objector feels romantically attracted to their spouse, so they might wake up in the morning, see their spouse, and say, "Good morning, honey, I love you." That is the emotional rendition. But if they were acting in a way that is consistent with their worldview, they should give the molecular rendition, which would sound something like, "Greetings, spouse. The pheromones in my brain have reacted in such a way that I have no choice but to feel attracted to you." That's not quite as romantic, and yet the objector thinks they really do love their spouse. If they were consistent, they would be like Spock from Star Trek, who is completely logical and has no emotion. That is, if we were purely molecular, then we would expect our so-called love for another person to be predetermined by pheromones or completely random with no purpose. And again, this is from the progress of science, not its absence. And even if what we feel were to be explained by science one day, adopting that belief would be so unpalatable that effectively it would still be a position of faith. So some think that our feelings are ultimately explained molecularly. If that is what they really believe, then they should live like it. Molecules don't generate beauty. Let's look at the pictures on the left, which I hope you find to be beautiful. Once again, there is a beautiful rendition, so describe it how you will, and then there is a molecular rendition. For the sunset pic, scientifically, the photons from the sun are being scattered by the Earth's atmosphere in different ways, so as to yield different colors. That is it, nothing more. For the mountain pic, the Earth's crust is buckling into mountain ranges, allowing certain alpine plants to grow. That is it, nothing more. For the wedding pic, I would like to congratulate the new couple because nature has selected a means by which the human species can pass on its genes. That is it, nothing more. If the naturalist sees something more in any of these things, then they are borrowing from faith. And even the feeling of awe we get when we look at such things, even if that was to be explained scientifically, I think that that would be so unpalatable to the naturalist that effectively they would still be having faith. Besides these things, the truth is that science has much to explain. This includes fully explaining embryonic development, where the baby basically develops from 2 cells into a human. To be honest, it's like something out of a Transformer movie. Genetics aren't fully understood either, especially gene regulation or epigenetics. Science can't explain the origin of the universe either. That is a non-scientific event. It doesn't fully explain black holes either. They are rather mysterious. And there is much more. It includes the causes of cancer, answering why the universe is accelerating, the interactions of drugs with each other called polypharmacy. Much is not known about the brain and the nervous system, or the endocrine system for that matter. There is gene regulation and eukaryotic transcription, which has to do with genetics. The nature of time, how gravity works, the weather, and the origin of life are all matters in which there are many unknowns. And yet we believe in these things, despite science not fully explaining them, or explaining them at all. If the sum of all available knowledge is a mine, then science has only scratched the surface. Ironically, it is the progress of science, not the lack of science, that makes us aware of just how much we don't know. One might say that ignorance is bliss. Perhaps one might disagree with me and say that science does explain some of these things. Well, I am curious as to what that explanation is. As far as I know, there hasn't been. But even if there was a scientific explanation that I missed, it is unlikely that the objector would be satisfied with such an explanation, meaning that effectively they would still have faith. This is particularly the case with consciousness, beauty, and emotions. And even if they were satisfied, the presence of a scientific explanation does not rule out the possibility of a faithful explanation. And all of this is based not on the absence of science. I'm not doing God of the gaps here, but on its progress. So in summary of part 3, some who say that faith and science contradict do so because they believe that science explains everything there is, that faithful, aka non-scientific, explanations do not exist. This proposition is fallacious in 2 ways. Firstly, it assumes that faith and science are mutually exclusive, that science drives out faith and that you can't have faith, when in fact the Bible says that faith and science work together. The second fallacy is the straw man fallacy, because the assumption is made that faith and science are mutually exclusive. A version of Christianity is attacked that is much weaker than the real version. The implication of this is that science explains everything there is, poses no real threat to faith. That is, both scientific and faithful explanations can exist. Besides being fallacious, this objection defeats itself in 2 ways, one time for every position of faith that the objector introduces. They introduce 2 positions of faith, meaning their objection defeats itself in 2 ways. The first is that science and faith are mutually exclusive. The second is that either science explains everything there is currently, or that it will explain everything in the future. Neither one can be proven by science. For every position of faith the objector introduces, their objection defeats itself, for faith is what they are trying to drive out. We also know from this that faith exists necessarily. There is no way around it. The third major problem is that the objector's worldview is vastly incomplete. There are many things that science cannot seem to explain. Not that we needed to address the idea that science explains everything. As stated earlier, that poses no real threat to faith. But we did anyway, for argument's sake. So these positions of faith include the 7 positions introduced in part 2, as well as a long list of things from part 3, such as consciousness, emotions, moral values, or the nature of gravity. And it is not from the lack of scientific progress that we come to that conclusion, but rather from the presence of it. These positions of faith are exercised so commonly by the objector that it makes this objection hypocritical, which is the 4th problem. That is, the objector objects to faith in words, but affirms it with their actions. So depending on if the objector is aware of this objection could be potentially dishonest. If the objector, in an attempt to save this objection, insists that science will one day explain these positions of faith, it actually creates more problems for the objection. These problems I italicized because they are not guaranteed to be relevant, although it is likely. So this attempt to save the objection has the opposite effect of what is intended. Besides affirming their second position of faith, this attempt vastly overestimates the capabilities of science, which creates more questions than it answers. This attempt also performs a massive extrapolation, where we extrapolate our limited scientific discoveries over all of space and all of time. Therefore, this attempted rescue plan replaces what it thinks is a God of the gaps fallacy with a science of the gaps fallacy. It assumes, without having the faintest idea how, and even in the face of conflicting evidence, that science will one day explain everything there is. Okay, so hopefully that shows why faith does not contradict the scope of science. That is the end of part 3. As far as intellectual difficulty goes, we are over the hump. In part 4, we will address the third objection, which is that faith contradicts the findings of science. See you then.